They say she rides in a phantom carriage drawn by 4 black horses, each with a headless rider, arriving at the gates of Blickling Hall on a night when the moon is thin and pale. The wheels make no sound, the hooves leave no mark. And in the carriage her head, in her lap sits Anne Boleyn, the queen who would not stay dead. For centuries, this has been the story in the Norfolk countryside. Farmers have sworn to it. Children have whispered it to one another in the safety of their beds. And perhaps, if the night is quiet enough, you might still hear the wheels on the gravel. Welcome to the Archive of Folly. Here we gather the histories that cannot be entirely buried and the myths that refuse to fade. Some of these stories are carved in marble, others in the air between one heartbeat and the next. And in this one, truth and legend walk together down the same dark Tudor corridors, their footsteps indistinguishable. If you find yourself drawn to these long roads between fact and fable, you might wish to linger here. There is always another chamber to unlock, another candle to light in the great, dim hall of history. Anne Boleyn was not born a ghost. She was born most likely in the summer of 1501 in a world where her name would have meant almost nothing outside a cluster of English manors. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was ambitious and calculating. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, carried a lineage older than wealth itself. But for all the genealogies and heraldry, Anne's early years were a quieter, almost pastoral chapter in what would become a blood-soaked book. We know almost nothing of her childhood voice, but we know where it would have echoed in the long galleries of Hever Castle in Kent, where the air smells faintly of water lilith from the moat. She learned early the polished French of diplomacy, that graceful tilt of the head that could win a moment's attention from the powerful. She was not raised for obscurity. Her father saw to that. At some point in her girlhood, Anne was sent across the Channel to the glittering courts of the continent, first to the Low Countries, then to France. It was there she learned the particular alchemy of survival in a court, never to be the dullest in the room, but never to be the brightest flame either, for that drew the moths and the hunters alike. Yet the young Anne, for all her carefulness, had an intensity about her. People remembered her eyes. And perhaps this is where the myth begins, not with her death, but with the moment people began to speak of her as if she were already more than herself. Even in the Valois court, she was said to have a charm that unsettled men who thought themselves immune to such things. A lady-in-waiting to queens, a fluent speaker of wit and insinuation, Anne was a woman who knew that survival was a performance. And like any performance, it could turn suddenly into a trap. When she returned to England, the stage was set for her tragedy. Henry VIII was already married to Catherine of Aragon, a queen whose virtue and dignity made her a living emblem of royal authority. But Henry was a man of restless hungers, and in Anne he found not simply beauty, but a spark that challenged him. She did not yield easily. She did not play the simpering courtier. That refusal, half defiance, half invitation only drew him deeper into her orbit. It is easy now, in the long after, to think of Anne Boleyn as a cautionary tale, the bright flame consumed by the Tudor sun. But in those first years, she was the one bending the light. The court saw it. Ambassadors reported it in nervous dispatches. The king's gaze followed her like a hawk's shadow on a meadow. And here, already, the ghost waits in the wings. At Blickling Hall, they say she appears not as a radiant court beauty, but as the condemned queen dressed in the plain dark gown of her last mourning, carrying her head with the same composure she once carried her gloves. To see her is to be reminded not of her triumphs, but of the price of them. It is as though her spirit walks backwards through time, dragging the night of her execution to every place she ever knew. But the living Anne was still very much alive in those years, navigating a court that could turn from a tapestry of pleasures to a scaffold of betrayals overnight. Henry's passion for her became an engine of political disaster, the breaking of England from Rome, the fall of noblemen, the rearranging of the kingdom's very soul to clear the path to her coronation. She must have known, somewhere deep within, that the same machinery which elevated her could, with the smallest shift, grind her into dust. But ambition is its own kind of haunting. It does not let you go simply because you sense the shadows gathering. And so Anne pressed forward, her crown gleaming, the eyes of Europe upon her, and the whispering began, not just of her beauty and wit, but of her danger. Some would later swear that the first ghost of Anne Boleyn appeared not after her death, but in the days when she was still alive. That in the corridors of Hampton Court, servants saw her pass twice in the same hour, once in conversation with the king, and again, moments later, gliding silently towards the chapel, her expression fixed on something far beyond the mortal world. Whether this was invention or foresight, it remains one of those moments in history where the veil feels suddenly thin. With the living and the spectral brush sleeves in a hallway no one else dares to enter. It is here, in the delicate web of fact and fable, that her story begins to take on its true Tudor shape. The rise that was also the fall, the courtship that was also the trap, the crown that was also the shroud. And all the while, somewhere in the future, the phantom carriage waits, its wheels turning soundlessly toward the scaffold. By 1533, Anne Boleyn was no longer merely a presence in Henry's orbit. She was the center of it. England itself seemed to tilt toward her, like a compass needle dragged by a hidden magnet. Her coronation, held that June, was meant to be a spectacle of legitimacy. The streets strewn with flowers, the air heavy with the scent of summer roses and the sharper tang of expectation. The people looked on, some cheering, some silent, beneath the gold canopy, and must have felt both triumph and the strange hollowness that comes when the long-sought thing finally arrives. She was pregnant, carrying what all of England assumed would be the long-desired male heir. In the portraits of the time, she wears her crown with a subtle tension in her jaw, as though she already understands that this is not the end of the game, only a new and more dangerous level. When Elizabeth was born that September, a healthy, red-haired daughter rather than a son, the applause dimmed. Henry did not discard Anne immediately. He still loved her, and Elizabeth was a legitimate Tudor. But the murmurings began, about God's disfavor, about the Queen's temperament, about whether she was truly the blessing Henry had imagined. Anne's enemies multiplied with the speed of rumors in a palace. The old nobility resented her for displacing Catherine of Aragon, a queen whose Spanish dignity had seemed unassailable. The conservative clergy saw her as the embodiment of Henry's defiance against the Pope. Even some who had once supported her now saw her as a dangerous liability, her sharp wit cutting too close to the bone. And yet she fought. Anne's intelligence was no ornament. It was a weapon. She involved herself in religious reform, aligning with evangelical thinkers who sought to shape the Church of England's new identity. She placed her allies in key positions, promoted her family's fortunes, and kept the king's attention with a mixture of charm, intellect, and calculated absence. But for every move forward, a shadow lengthened behind her. It is here that the ghost begins to follow her in earnest. At the Tower of London, they say she can still be seen on moonlit nights, gliding along the battlements, her gown rustling though there is no wind. Some swear she is headless. Others say she carries herself exactly as she did in life, serene and unbowed, until she vanishes at the very door of the chapel where she was buried. The tower holds many ghosts, but hers is different. It is the quiet inevitability of her presence, as though the place itself cannot forget her. The fatal turn came in 1536. Anne suffered a miscarriage in January, and though the details are shrouded in gossip and contradiction, it was said that the child was male. In a court that measured a queen's worth by her sons, this was a wound to her position from which she could not easily recover. Henry's eye had already begun to wander toward Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose gentleness seemed the perfect foil to Anne's fire. What happened next has been told and retold, embroidered with malice, softened by sympathy. twisted into cautionary tales. Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were almost certainly false, their purpose political, to sweep her from the board without the inconvenience of divorce. But once the accusations began, the outcome was inevitable. Her arrest in May was swift, almost theatrical. She was taken to the Tower, the same tower where she had entered in triumph 3 years earlier for her coronation banquet. Now she came as a prisoner. Contemporary accounts describe her as alternately composed and agitated, protesting her innocence, asking to see the king, praying aloud. It was in those final days that she began to speak with the strange calm of one who sees the end, and yet is already standing beyond it. The ghost stories would later say that in those last nights, her figure could be seen pacing her cell, her head already gone, as if her spirit were rehearsing for the moment to come. The guards told such tales in the years afterward, perhaps to frighten the superstitious, perhaps because some part of them believed it. The truth is that Anne herself, in life, left a haunting impression on all who saw her then. A queen brought low not by scandal of her own making, but by the machinery of a court that could grind a human being into dust for the sake of convenience. On the morning of May 19, 1536, she walked to the scaffold built within the Tower grounds. She wore a gray gown over a crimson petticoat, her hair bound under a simple coif. The French swordsman Henry had summoned for the task stood ready. She gave a short speech gracious to the king, forgiving to all, a final performance of the composure that had once been her shield. Then she knelt upright, no block beneath her, and in a single stroke the deed was done. They buried her in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower, but in another sense she was never laid to rest. Her presence persisted in whispers, in portraits, in the uneasy dreams of those who had watched her die. And so the sightings multiplied. At Blickling Hall, she arrives every May 19th, her spectral carriage rolling to the door at midnight before vanishing into the dark. At Sale Church, she is said to kneel in prayer, her head beside her on the pew. In the Tower, she paces the battlements, sometimes with her head, sometimes without, always in silence. It is tempting to think of these visions as mere folklore, but there is something deeper at work in them. They are the aftershocks of a life that altered the course of a kingdom, a life cut short, but too deeply imprinted to be erased. Anne Boleyn became, in death, a kind of mirror for England's own conscience. And perhaps that is why she still walks, not for revenge, but because the living have never stopped calling her name. The decades after Anne's death did nothing to quiet her. If anything, her story began to shed the particulars of politics and take on the shimmering contours of legend. The Tudors themselves were uneasy custodians of her memory. Henry married Jane Seymour within days of Anne's execution, and though Jane gave him the male heir he craved, she died soon after. His subsequent wives were caught in a strange gravitational pull, either compared to Anne's wit and spirit, or contrasted against her supposed danger. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, grew to womanhood without ever publicly dwelling on her mother's fate, yet the shadow of it was never far away. In portraits, Elizabeth's high, dark eyes recall Anne's own. In her guarded speech and careful alliances, one can almost hear the lessons of her mother's fall. But Elizabeth's reign, with all its triumphs, did not dispel the ghost. If anything, it gave her new rooms to haunt. By the 17th century, Anne's presence was no longer confined to the memories of those who had known her. In Norfolk, the legend of Blickling Hall began to crystallize. The estate had belonged to the Boleyn family before her birth, and though Anne may never have lived there for long, it became the spiritual seat of her myth. Villagers told of a phantom carriage that arrived each year on the anniversary of her death, the horse's eyes like burning coals, the wheels spinning without sound. Inside sat Anne, her face serene, her severed head resting in her lap. What is striking about these accounts is their consistency. Generations apart, tellers describe the same eerie stillness, the same sense of inevitability, as though the apparition is less a wandering soul than a yearly ritual, a piece of time itself replaying on an endless loop. The carriage never lingers. It stops at the great front door for a moment long enough for anyone watching to doubt what they've seen before vanishing into the night. The Tower of London kept its own traditions. Yeoman warders, the beefeaters who served as ceremonial guardians, told of seeing her figure by moonlight. Sometimes she would be headless, walking swiftly as if late to some appointment. At other times she appeared whole, standing in silent contemplation near the site of the scaffold, her hands folded, her gaze fixed far beyond the living. In one tale from the 1800s, a guard was said to have fainted at the sight of her in the White Tower, her form glowing faintly before dissolving into the air. At Sale Church, a quieter haunting unfolded. This small Norfolk parish claimed to be one of the places Anne's body, or part of it, was brought after her execution, though there is no historical proof. Still, locals spoke of seeing her in the pews, her head placed neatly beside her, her lips moving in silent prayer. These sightings, unlike the grand spectacle of Blickling Hall, carried a sense of intimacy, as though the ghost came not to terrify, but to seek some peace the centuries had denied her. Even as the Enlightenment brought skepticism to England, Anne's legend refused to be extinguished. The Victorians, with their fascination for both morality tales and the supernatural, embraced her as a romantic figure, a wronged woman destroyed by the caprice of a tyrant king. In their hands, she became almost saint-like, a symbol of innocence betrayed. Yet in the same era, more macabre versions persisted, lingering in country folklore. Anne as the headless rider, Anne as the pale figure by the riverbank, Anne as the ghostly light flickering in an abandoned gallery. It is worth asking why Anne's ghost became so fixed in the English imagination when so many other Tudor figures faded into history without spectral afterlives. Perhaps it is because her death was more than a private tragedy. It was a rupture in the order of things. The king had remade his kingdom for her, broken from Rome, unseated a queen beloved by many. And yet, within 3 short years, he had destroyed her. The dissonance of that such monumental change, followed by such swift erasure, demanded a kind of haunting. There is another theory, whispered by those who study the lore of ghosts, that spirits return not because they cannot rest, but because the living will not let them. In Anne's case, the centuries of retelling, the portraits, the plays, the novels, all have called her back again and again. Each new witness to her carriage, each child told of her pacing in the tower, becomes part of the chain that binds her to the world. In this way, Anne Boleyn became both a warning and a comfort. A warning to those who would think the power of a crown could shield them from the axe. A comfort to those who believe that injustice cannot silence a voice forever. Her life and death had been turned over like a gem, each facet catching a different light ambition, betrayal, faith, defiance, and her ghost walks within all of them. And perhaps that is why, when the wind rattles the windows of Blickling Hall in late May, there are still those who draw the curtains and wait, listening for the faint, impossible sound of wheels on gravel. They know, as their grandparents knew, that the Queen may be passing by once more, her eyes fixed not on them, but on some destination beyond the living world. The centuries have only thickened the air around Anne Boleyn's story. Each retelling, each candlelit tour of the tower, each shiver passed from parent to child on the road to Blickling Hall. These are not merely repetitions of a ghost tale. They are acts of preservation, keeping alive both the woman and the question she leaves behind. For in the archive, Anne's file is not a relic. It is still breathing. The parchment of her life is written in 2 inks, the dark, indelible record of what the court scribes set down, and the paler, shifting script of all that could not be proved, but could not be silenced. When you hold those pages together, they do not align neatly. Facts and whispers slip over one another like the layers of a palimpsest, each hinting at a different truth. What is certain is that Anne Boleyn altered the course of England more in death than she ever could in life. Her daughter Elizabeth would reign for 45 years, steering the realm into an age of unmatched influence. Yet Elizabeth spoke of her mother rarely and never publicly. Perhaps this was caution. Perhaps it was the way one guards a wound too deep to expose. Or perhaps she, more than anyone, understood that her mother had already become something beyond the reach of mortal defense. An emblem, a warning, and to some, a specter. Anne's afterlife in the imagination was helped along by every age's need to remake her. The Protestant reformers saw in her a martyr to the English Church's independence. The Victorians, with their appetite for tragic heroines, crowned her in the court of romance. Modern historians have combed her letters, weighed the testimonies at her trial, and stripped away the layers of invention. Yet when all the analysis is done, the ghost remains. It is not hard to understand why. The image of a headless queen composed, unhurried, gliding through moonlit stone halls, seizes something primal in the mind. It makes visible what is usually unseen, the unfinished business, the injustice unrighted, the refusal to be erased. Whether or not such a figure truly walks the Tower or the lanes of Norfolk is almost beside the point. What matters is that people believe she does, and have believed it for nearly 500 years. And so the question lingers. Are these sightings born of guilt, fascination, or something more spectral? Perhaps all three. The guilt belongs to the England that traded a woman's life for political convenience. The fascination is ours, drawn to the sharp outline of a life lived at the very edge of power. And the spectral? That belongs to the mystery that will not be solved, not by archivists, nor historians, nor the centuries themselves. When the night deepens over Blickling Hall, and the wind presses against the glass, the boundary between past and present can feel thinner than a whisper. You might hear the carriage long before you see it, the faint roll of wheels without weight, the muffled thud of hooves that never touch the earth. And then there she is, framed in the carriage window, eyes fixed on the path ahead, her head cradled like a relic in her hands. The scene lasts only a heartbeat before it is gone, leaving nothing but the restless air. And here, in the quiet that follows, is the truest echo of Anne Boleyn's story. A life that could not be contained by the century that claimed it. A death that could not seal the tomb. A queen who would not stay dead. In this archive, she is not merely a ghost. She is a reminder that history is not the sum of what happened, but of what we cannot stop telling. That some figures stride so forcefully through their brief hours that the door will never quite shut behind them. And that every time her story is spoken, whether in a hall lit by electric light or in the hushed breath of a countryside lane at midnight, the carriage draws nearer, the wheels turn again, and the queen takes her place on the road between the living and the dead.